A simple swim led to a $1,000 fine, then my dog's murder, and a terrifying secret buried deep under my own lake. You owe us $1,000 for swimming. Are you kidding me right now? This crazy HOA woman just handed me the most expensive violation in neighborhood history for using my own family lake. But here's what she doesn't know. I'm about to turn her biggest mistake into my greatest victory. By the end of this story, she'll be the one paying me $5,000 every year. And trust me, that's not even the craziest part. What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about HOA power trips. This gets so wild that Hollywood couldn't write a better revenge story. Comment where you're watching from. You're going to need popcorn for this. Let me back up and tell you how this insanity started. My name's Logan Reed, and I'm a 45-year-old high school history teacher who just wanted to live peacefully in my grandmother's lakefront cottage. You know how they say no good deed goes unpunished? Well, try inheriting a beautiful property and see what happens when the neighborhood vultures smell fresh blood in the water. It was a Tuesday, and I just finished the most brutal parent-teacher conferences of my 20s. You know the type. Parents who think their little angel couldn't possibly be failing because they're gifted, and it's obviously my fault for not recognizing their genius. I was stressed, exhausted, and desperately needed my daily swim to decompress. The lake behind my house had always been my sanctuary, the one place where I could forget about teenagers who wouldn't stop talking and parents who wouldn't stop complaining. I'd inherited this cottage when my grandmother passed, and it had become my refuge from the world. The water was still dripping from my hair when the clipboard appeared in my peripheral vision. "Stop! You're contaminating the community watershed." The voice belonged to Grace Perez, a woman I'd seen around the neighborhood but never really talked to. She was dressed like she was heading to a business meeting. Designer tracksuit, perfectly styled hair, and that clipboard clutched like it was some kind of weapon. I'm standing there in my own backyard, dripping wet and confused, while this woman is treating me like I just dumped toxic waste into a drinking fountain. "Excuse me?" I said, because honestly, what do you even say to that? This is my private lake. I was just swimming. Grace smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see right before someone ruins your entire day. "Your HOA membership agreement makes all water features community property, Mr. Reed. You're violating Environmental Protection Code 15C, unauthorized swimming activities, causing chemical runoff into the community watershed system." She held up some official-looking device that was supposedly measuring water contamination level. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd stepped into some alternate reality where swimming in your own lake was a federal crime. That's when she dropped the bomb. Environmental impact assessment and restoration fee, $1,000 plus $150 accumulation, until certified environmental compliance is achieved. $1,000 for swimming in my own lake. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but Grace was dead serious. Her hands were shaking slightly as she wrote out the citation, and I couldn't help but notice the pawn shop tag still dangling from her expensive purse. When her phone buzzed, she glanced at the screen, something about a final notice, and quickly declined the call, her jaw tightening with what looked like panic. "Look, there's obviously been some mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "My family has owned this lake since I have the original deed," but Grace was already backing away, that fake smile plastered on her face. "Some people think property ownership means they can pollute whatever they want, Mr. Reed. We've had incidents in the past with irresponsible pet owners." Something about the way she said that last part made my blood run cold. There was a cruelty in her voice that reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place what. That night I couldn't sleep. Something about Grace's visit felt wrong on every level, and my teacher instincts were screaming that this woman was dangerous. I spent hours researching HOA, environmental codes, property rights, and anything else that might explain what had just happened to me. That's when I found a newspaper article. 3 dogs die from chemical poisoning after HOA environmental project. My hands started shaking as I read the details. Buddy's name was right there in black and white, along with photos of 2 other neighborhood dogs that had died from accidental chemical runoff. The article quoted Grace Perez, HOA president, defending the necessary environmental maintenance that had somehow resulted in 3 pet deaths. Property maintenance standards must be upheld regardless of pet owner negligence, she told the reporter. Reading those words felt like getting punched in the stomach. I remembered that horrible week when Buddy got sick. The emergency vet visits, the $4,200 in bills, holding my best friend as he died in agony from what we thought was accidental poisoning. But it wasn't accidental, was it? Grace had murdered my dog, and now she was coming for my property. I called Detective Luis Wilson that night. Luis had been my father's partner for 15 years, and after Dad died, he'd become like family to me. Grace Perez killed Buddy and now she's coming for me, I told him, my voice shaking with rage and grief. I never forgot that case, Logan, Luis replied immediately. I always suspected it wasn't accidental. Your father would want justice for his grandson's dog. That's what my dad used to call Buddy, his grandson. The idea that someone had deliberately poisoned that sweet, innocent animal made me feel murderous. Luis ran Grace's background overnight and called me back in the morning with information that made everything click into place. She's got $75,000 in gambling debt, Logan. Her house is in foreclosure. She's got 90 days to come up with $52,000 or lose everything. She's been issuing bogus violations left and right, targeting the expensive properties in the neighborhood. The pattern was crystal clear. Grace was a desperate criminal, using her HOA position to generate illegal revenue, and my lakefront property was probably worth more than anything else in the area. But here's where the story gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely terrifying. The next morning, I woke up to find Grace standing outside my fence in the morning. I thought she was taking photos for more fake violations. But then I heard her talking quietly on her phone. The teacher won't be a problem much longer, she was saying. Yes, I know exactly how to handle people like him. Just get it done by Friday. When she noticed me watching through my window, she quickly ended the call and waved at me with that same chilling smile. Just get it done by Friday. What the hell did that mean? What is Grace planning that's so much worse than violations? And who was she talking to? Luis Wilson arrived at my house in the morning, carrying coffee and what looked like a very thick police file. I failed your father and I failed Buddy, Logan. I'm not gonna fail you, he said, setting down the file with a heavy thud. Inside were Luis's original notes from Buddy's case, pages and pages of evidence that had been dismissed as circumstantial. Seeing my dog's photos in an official police file broke something inside me, but it also lit a fire that wouldn't be put out until Grace paid for what she'd done. Your friend Grace is a textbook desperate gambler, Luis explained, spreading out financial records across my kitchen table. $75,000 in casino debt, $28,000 in medical bills from her late husband's cancer treatment, and a foreclosure notice that's very real and very final. The psychology is textbook. When legal gambling stops working, they turn to fraud and theft. She's been systematically targeting wealthy homeowners with fabricated violations, and your lakefront property is the biggest prize in the neighborhood. Within a week, Grace's harassment campaign escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. Day 1 brought a $400 fine for noise pollution from excessive swimming splashing. Day 2 was $5,500 unauthorized dock modifications. Apparently the dock my grandmother had built was now considered an environmental hazard. By day 7 I was looking at over $3,000 in completely fabricated violations. The woman was relentless, showing up at my house at all hours to document imaginary infractions with her fake environmental testing equipment. But Grace wasn't just targeting me. My neighbor Tom, a mechanic who'd lived in the area for 20 years, approached me during her second week of terror. She fined me $1,100 for parking my work truck in my own driveway, he told me, shaking his head in disbelief. Apparently it's a commercial vehicle violation, even though I've been parking that truck there for 2 decades without any problems. As we talked, more neighbors started coming forward with similar stories. Maria got $800 for excessive holiday decoration. She'd hung a single wreath on her door. Frank was hit with $950 for his vegetable garden, which Grace classified as unauthorized landscaping modifications. The pattern was crystal clear and absolutely infuriating. Grace was systematically targeting every family in the neighborhood who looked like they might have money, issuing bogus violations totaling over $22,000 in just 8 weeks. But here's what really got to me. She wasn't just stealing money. She was terrorizing people in their own homes making them afraid to enjoy their own properties. The psychological warfare was almost worse than the financial fraud. That's when Emily Smith, the HOA treasurer, reached out to me in secret. Emily was a single mom who desperately needed her treasurer position for health insurance. But what she discovered in the HOA financial records was eating her alive. Grace has stolen $38,000 through fake vendor invoices, Emily whispered during our clandestine coffee shop meeting. She created a shell company called Environmental Solutions LLC and has been paying herself for services that never existed. I have bank statements, forged authorization forms with my signature, everything you'd need to prove fraud. Emily's hands were literally shaking as she showed me the evidence. My daughter needs to see me do the right thing, she said. But Grace threatened my job when I started asking questions about the missing money. She told me that accident-prone employees sometimes lose their positions, and I knew exactly what she meant. The courage it took for Emily to come forward knowing she might lose her livelihood was incredible. But she'd reached her breaking point when she discovered Grace had used stolen money meant for the children's playground equipment to pay her gambling debts at the casino. Luis's plan was elegant in its simplicity. We're going to get her to confess everything on tape, he told me. Desperate people make stupid mistakes when they think they're about to win big. You're going to call Grace and tell her you can't afford to fight anymore, that you want to work out a private settlement. She'll think she's finally broken you, and that overconfidence will make her sloppy. The psychological manipulation felt risky, but Luis had seen this pattern dozens of times in his career. Gambling addicts can't resist what looks like an easy score. When I called Grace, I made sure to sound completely defeated. I can't afford more legal battles, Grace. Maybe we can work something out privately. The excitement in her voice was immediate and disturbing. Finally, someone who understands environmental responsibility, she practically purred. I knew you'd see reason eventually, Mr. Reed. Why don't you come over to my house tomorrow evening, and we can discuss a reasonable settlement. The wire Luis had fitted me with would record every word. Grace's house was a monument to someone trying desperately to maintain appearances while everything fell apart around them. The landscaping was perfect. The exterior paint was fresh, but when she opened the door, I could see the foreclosure notice taped to her kitchen window. She had set up our meeting like a business negotiation with prepared documents spread across her dining room table, and that same fake environmental testing device prominently displayed. Her hands were shaking worse than ever, and she kept glancing at her phone like she was expecting important news. I'm glad we can resolve this like civilized adults, Grace began, but there was nothing civilized about the predatory gleam in her eyes. Your lakefront property generates significant environmental concerns for the entire community watershed. A 50-50 shared access arrangement would benefit everyone involved. 50-50. This woman wanted half ownership of my family's lake based on completely fabricated environmental violations. The audacity was breathtaking, but I forced myself to stay in character as the defeated victim. I keep thinking about my dog, Buddy, I said carefully, watching her reaction. You were involved in environmental issues then too, right? Grace's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and cruel flash across her face. That dog contaminated community water with waste, she snapped. Irresponsible pet owners endanger entire neighborhoods. I had to use extreme measures to protect community environmental standards. There it was, a full confession to murdering my best friend, recorded on Luis's wire for posterity. But Grace wasn't done. The floodgates had opened, and years of justifying her crimes came pouring out. Your lakefront property affects everyone's water quality and property values, she continued, her voice getting more agitated. I found creative environmental assessment funding through HOA resources to ensure proper oversight. She had just confessed to both animal cruelty and embezzlement in the same breath, and she was too worked up to realize what she'd done. That's when Luis Wilson stepped out from behind my car with handcuffs ready. Grace's transformation from confident predator to cornered animal happened in seconds. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement and criminal harassment, Luis announced. But Grace was already screaming about entrapment and conspiracies. As the handcuffs clicked shut, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Buddy died. Justice was finally within reach. But as the police car drove away with Grace inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A black sedan with out-of-state plates had been parked across the street, and it was now following the police car at a discreet distance. Tom, who'd been watching the arrest from his driveway, jogged over with a worried expression. "Logan, that car has been parked there for days." Emily mentioned Grace, kept talking about someone who was coming to handle the situation. Who was Grace working with? And why do they still seem interested in me now that she's been arrested? Look, I thought arresting Grace would be the end of this nightmare. Boy, was I wrong. The community meeting the next evening looked more like a battlefield than a neighborhood gathering, and I was about to learn that sometimes winning the first battle just means you're in for a much bigger war. 78 residents packed into our community center, the highest attendance in HOA history. But this wasn't the unified celebration of justice I'd naively expected. The room was literally split down the middle, with Grace's supporters on one side shooting daggers at those of us who'd supported her arrest. You could cut the tension with a knife. Tom had volunteered to chair the emergency meeting, bless his heart, but even his military background hadn't prepared him for this level of civilian warfare. "We're here to decide whether we remove a criminal from office or destroy an innocent woman's life," announced Helen Morrison, a 78-year-old retired teacher who had somehow become Grace's most passionate defender. Grace Perez has kept our property values high. She organized charity drives. She helped elderly neighbors with groceries. Helen's speech got enthusiastic applause from 37 residents who genuinely believed I was the real villain in this story. Mike Peterson, a 45-year-old insurance guy, stood up looking like he wanted to crawl under a rock. "Look, I don't know what to believe anymore, but what if we're wrong? What if Grace is innocent, and we're about to get sued into bankruptcy for destroying her reputation? I've got 2 kids in college. I can't afford to be wrong about this." The fear in his voice was real, and that's when I realized what I was really up against. For half my neighbors, supporting meant risking financial disaster if they'd misjudged Grace's guilt. Talk about pressure. When Tom called for my presentation of evidence, you could hear a pin drop. Playing that wire recording of Grace confessing to poisoning Buddy felt like detonating a nuclear bomb in the middle of a church service. People literally gasped when her voice filled the room. I had to use extreme measures to protect community environmental standards. But even with Grace's own words condemning her, her supporters weren't backing down. "That recording could be edited," Helen shouted. "It's convenient evidence from someone with obvious motives for revenge. I mean, come on. What kind of Hollywood special effects budget did they think I had?" That's when Emily Smith stood up, and I swear I've never seen more raw courage in my entire life. This single mother, who desperately needed her HOA treasurer job for health insurance, walked to the front of that HOSTA room, carrying a banker's box that probably weighed more than her future job security. "Grace Perez has embezzled $38,000 from our community fund," Emily announced, her voice shaking, but absolutely determined. "I have bank statements, forged authorization documents with my signature, and proof of fake vendor payments to a company Grace created herself." The room exploded like someone had thrown gasoline on a campfire. Parents who had been defending Grace 60 seconds earlier were now demanding to know what happened to their children's playground money. Rita Silva, a grandmother in her 60s, looked like she was going to throw up. "My granddaughter keeps asking when we're getting those new swings Grace promised," she whispered. "You're telling me Grace stole that money to gamble?" When Emily nodded and pulled out casino withdrawal records that matched the stolen amounts almost exactly, you could watch people's faith in Grace crumble in real time. It was like watching dominoes fall, except each domino was someone's trust getting shattered. The vote to remove Grace from all HOA positions passed by the narrowest possible margin: 41 in favor, 37 opposed. 4 votes, 4 lousy votes between justice and letting a criminal keep terrorizing our community. Winning by that slim margin felt more like losing, especially when half your neighbors still think you're some kind of vindictive monster. The financial crisis, Emily revealed, made everything 10 times worse. We had exactly $1,200 left after Grace's theft. That's not enough to fix a pothole, let alone run a community association or defend against the lawsuits Grace's supporters kept threatening. "I'll contribute $5,000 annually for community lake access rights," I announced, knowing our HOA desperately needed stable income just to keep the lights on. "It's below market rate for lakefront amenities, and it'll provide the financial stability we need moving forward." Even that generous offer barely passed 40 votes in favor. So there I was, essentially paying tribute to a community where half the residents still thought I was the bad guy. The irony was so thick you could swim in it. Grace had tried to steal my lake, and now I was paying the community to use it legitimately. But Grace wasn't done with me yet. Oh no. This woman had connections I never saw coming. Within 48 hours of her arrest, 12 parents at my school filed formal complaints demanding my removal as a teacher. 12. They painted me as an unstable individual, engaging in criminal harassment of community members, and my principal, Williams, called me into her office with an expression that said, my 23-year teaching career might be over before the week was done. Logan, I've known you for 8 years, and I don't believe a word of these accusations, Williams said, but the district is getting serious pressure from some very influential families. We have to conduct a formal investigation into your conduct, which means you're suspended with pay pending the outcome. Suspended for fighting back against someone who had murdered my dog and robbed my neighbor. The injustice of it hit me like a freight train, especially when I realized some of these complaining parents had kids in my own classes who'd probably heard their mom and dad calling their teacher a crazy person at the dinner table. The harassment campaign against me went way beyond professional sabotage. Someone, and I had pretty strong suspicions about who was coordinating this, launched a systematic terror operation designed to make my life hell. My car got keyed 3 times in 1 week. Someone took a baseball bat to my mailbox and left the pieces scattered across my lawn like some kind of warning. Every single night my house got egged on by people who apparently had nothing better to do than drive around throwing breakfast products at windows. The grand finale was someone spray painting "Community Destroyer" across my garage door in bright red letters that probably cost me $800 to remove. Lewis Wilson started doing extra patrols around my house, but the worry in his eyes scared me more than the vandalism. Grace made bail yesterday, he told me during one of his evening check-ins. Someone posted $35,000 cash. That's not money she could access from jail. She's got financial backing from somewhere, Logan, and whoever it is has serious resources to throw around. The idea that Grace had powerful allies still working on her behalf while she sat in jail was absolutely terrifying. What the hell had I gotten myself into by fighting back against what I thought was just a corrupt HOA president? That's when the professional level break-ins start. I'm not talking about some drunk teenager smashing a window and grabbing your electronics. These were surgical operations that left almost no trace except for things being slightly out of place. I'd come home from another nightmare day dealing with my job suspension to find books moved on shelves, computer files accessed while I was gone, and desk drawers open. Just someone was methodically searching my house on a regular basis, looking for something specific, and they had skills that made my blood run cold. The final straw came in the morning on a Thursday. I woke up to the sound of someone testing my back door handle, then moving systematically around the house, checking every window for a way inside. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping next to my bed and whispered into my phone while calling 911. There's someone trying to break into my house. They're checking all the windows. But when police arrived 15 minutes later, whoever it was had vanished like smoke, leaving only muddy footprints that led straight to my lake's edge, and then just stopped like they'd walked into the water and disappeared. My security camera caught someone in full scuba gear coming out of your lake this morning, Tom told me the next day, showing me footage that made my hands shake. A figure in complete diving equipment had emerged from my lake, like some kind of underwater ninja, moved around my house for 20 minutes, doing God knows what, then slipped back into the water without leaving a trace. Logan, what kind of people have underwater approach capabilities? This isn't some random burglar. This is military-level operational planning. What the hell were they looking for in your lake? Who would go to such lengths to get into my house? And what were they looking for underwater? Grace's defense attorney was everything you'd expect from someone representing a desperate criminal, with mysterious financial backing, expensive suit, practiced charm, and absolutely zero conscience about defending a woman who'd poisoned innocent animals for money. During the first day of jury selection, I watched him work the potential jurors like a master manipulator, painting Grace as a devoted widow driven to desperation by medical bills and gambling addiction. My client is a victim of circumstances, he declared dramatically, not a predator targeting innocent neighbors. The prosecution's case should have been a slam dunk, We had Grace's recorded confession to murdering Buddy, Emily's documentation of $38,000 in embezzlement, and testimony from 15 neighbors about systematic fraudulent violation. But Grace's lawyer was playing a different game entirely, one focused on emotion rather than evidence. He paraded character witnesses who testified about Grace's volunteer work, her late husband's cancer battle, and her tragic descent into gambling addiction after losing the love of her life. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Grace's attorney said during opening statements, "You're going to hear about mistakes made by a grieving woman who lost control of her life after watching her husband die slowly and painfully. But you're also going to hear about entrapment, about a vindictive neighbor who orchestrated an elaborate scheme to destroy a woman who was trying to protect community environmental standards. Grace Perez is not a criminal. She's a victim of her own desperation and Logan Reed's desire for revenge." Watching Grace perform for the jury was like watching a masterclass in manipulation. Gone was the cold, predatory woman who'd threatened me in my own backyard. In her place, a frail, broken widow who dabbed at her eyes with tissues while describing her husband's final month. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," she whispered into the microphone, her voice barely audible. "The dog's dying was a terrible accident during necessary environmental treatment. I was just trying to protect our community's water quality like I'd been trained to do." When the prosecution played our wire recording, Grace's performance shifted seamlessly to righteous indignation. "I was speaking metaphorically about environmental protection," she insisted. "Mr. Reed tricked me into saying things that sounded incriminating when taken out of context. I've been protecting this community, and this is how I'm repaid." Her ability to reframe every piece of evidence as either accidental or misunderstood was genuinely impressive in the most horrifying way possible. But Emily's financial testimony was devastating in a way that even Grace couldn't spin. When Emily walked the jury through $38,000 of forged documents, fake vendor invoices, and unauthorized transfers to Grace's personal accounts, the courtroom fell silent. "She wasn't protecting the community," Emily said firmly, looking directly at Grace. "She was stealing from children's playground funds to pay her gambling debts. I have bank records showing Grace's casino withdrawals, matching exactly with amounts stolen from our community emergency fund." The jury deliberated for 3 agonizing days, while I paced the courthouse halls, second-guessing every decision that had brought me to this point. Luis tried to keep my spirits up, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Jury trials are unpredictable," he kept saying. "All it takes is one holdout who believes her sob story." The waiting was torture, especially knowing that Grace's mysterious backers were still out there, still interested in whatever they thought was hidden in my life. When the jury foreman announced guilty on all counts, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Buddy died: pure, overwhelming relief. Grace's performance crumbled instantly. Gone was the grieving widow act, replaced by screaming accusations about conspiracies and frame jobs as bailiffs dragged her from the courtroom. "You have no idea what you've done," she shrieked at me. "This isn't over. You don't understand what you're really dealing with." Judge Patricia Washington, a no-nonsense veteran of white-collar crime cases, wasn't impressed by Grace's theatrics. "Mrs. Perez, you systematically defrauded your neighbors, embezzlement community funds, and committed premeditated animal cruelty for financial gain. The court sentences you to 4 years and 8 months in state prison, with restitution of $45,000 to be paid to your victims. You are permanently banned from serving in any HOA or community leadership position." The sentencing hearing was packed with neighbors who'd driven down to see justice served. Tom gave a powerful victim impact statement about how Grace's harassment had affected his family's sense of security in their own home. Emily spoke about the courage it took to expose someone who'd threatened her livelihood. But my statement was the one that seemed to hit hardest with both the judge and the packed courtroom. "Your Honor, Grace Perez didn't just steal money from our community," I said, looking directly at Grace as I spoke. "She murdered my best friend to intimidate me, then tried to steal my family's property when intimidation didn't work. She terrorized an entire neighborhood to feed her gambling addiction, and she showed absolutely zero remorse until the moment she realized she might face consequences. Buddy was an innocent animal who died in agony because Grace decided his life was worth less than her financial problems. That's not desperation, that's evil." Grace was led away in handcuffs to begin her sentence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. As the crowd dispersed and neighbors congratulated me on getting justice, I noticed Grace's expensive lawyer having an intense whispered conversation with a well-dressed stranger I'd never seen before. The man was taking photos of me with his phone, while the lawyer handed him what looked like a very thick manila envelope. The teacher doesn't understand what he's really gotten himself into, I heard the lawyer say as I walked past their conversation. The stranger looked directly at me with cold, calculating eyes that made my skin crawl. Don't worry, he replied quietly. We'll handle the situation from here. What situation? Grace was in prison, her crimes exposed, justice served. What could there possibly be left to handle? Luis noticed my distraction as we left the courthouse. Something wrong, Logan? He asked, scanning the crowd with the professional paranoia of a 25-year police veteran. I told him about the conversation I'd overheard, and his expression darkened immediately. Grace is in prison, but someone with serious money has been backing her from the beginning. That $35,000 bail came from somewhere, and expensive lawyers don't work for free. We need to stay alert. That night I should have been celebrating. Grace Perez was behind bars. My community was safe, and justice had prevailed after months of psychological warfare. Instead, I lay awake wondering what Grace's lawyer had meant about me, not understanding what I was really dealing with. The man in the expensive suit had looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving, and that look reminded me uncomfortably of Grace's predatory smile when she'd first issued that $1,000 violation. Grace is in prison, but who is the mysterious man with her lawyer? And what did I get myself into that I don't understand? You know what's funny about hitting rock bottom? It gives you a crystal clear view of who you really are and what you're actually capable of. After Grace's sentencing, I was technically unemployed. The school district had quietly suggested I might be happier elsewhere. After all the controversy, financially drained from legal fees and dealing with half a neighborhood that still thought I was the villain. But I'd also just helped expose and convict a criminal. And that experience had taught me something valuable. Most people have no idea how to fight institutional corruption. The first speaking engagement came by accident. Judy Mitchell, who ran the regional HOA management conference, had been following Grace's case in the local news and called to ask if I'd be willing to share my story. We have 300 property managers and board members coming to our annual conference, she explained. They need to understand how HOA corruption happens and how communities can prevent it. The idea of standing in front of 300 strangers and reliving the worst months of my life was terrifying, but the speaking fee of $2,500 was more than I'd made in my last month of teaching. That first speech changed everything. Standing on stage at the Marriott Conference Center, looking out at an audience of people who dealt with HOA drama every single day, I realized I'd accidentally become an expert in something most people desperately needed to understand. When I finished telling Grace's story, the fake violations, the embezzlement, the animal cruelty, the community's psychological warfare, the applause went on for nearly 5 minutes. But more importantly, the questions afterward showed me just how widespread this problem was. I've got an HOA president in my development who's been issuing questionable fines, one woman told me during the break. Your documentation methods could save our community. A man from Arizona approached with a story that sounded eerily familiar. Our treasurer has been acting strange about financial records, and several homeowners have gotten expensive violations that seem targeted. How did you prove systematic fraud? By the end of that conference, I had 12 people asking for private consultations and 6 more communities requesting speaking engagement. The HOA Defense Academy started as a simple online course teaching people how to document violations, research property rights, and organize community resistance to corrupt leadership. I figured maybe 100 people might be interested in learning these techniques. But within the first month, 47 students had enrolled at 200. The math hit me like lightning. That was over $250,000 in revenue from something that had cost me almost nothing to create, except time and expertise I'd gained by surviving Grace's attack. But the real breakthrough came when I started documenting other communities' success stories. Maria Santos, a grandmother from Texas who'd taken my course, used my techniques to expose an HOA. Your methods saved our retirement community, she wrote in an email that made me realize this was bigger than just revenge against Grace. The documentation process you taught us, provided everything the police needed to make arrests and recover most of our stolen money. The lake access fees I'd negotiated with my own community turned out to be just the beginning of that revenue stream. Word spread quickly among neighboring HOAs about my successful community mediation, and suddenly I had 4 different communities competing to secure lake access rights for their residents. The bidding war that developed was almost hilarious. What started as a $5,000 annual fee to help my struggling community became $10,000 per year as HOAs tried to outbid each other for exclusive lakefront privileges. Corporate event hosting became another unexpected goldmine. Apparently, there's a huge demand for authentic lakefront experiences for company retreats and team-building events. My first corporate booking was a tech startup that paid $3,500. But by month 6 I was charging $8,500 per event and booking every weekend through the following year. The irony wasn't lost on me that Grace's attempt to steal my lake was making it more valuable than I'd ever imagined. The book deal happened because of persistence from an agent who had seen my viral news interviews about fighting HOA corruption. Fighting HOA Corruption, A Teacher's Guide to Community Justice, felt like a ridiculous title for someone who'd never planned to write anything more complicated than lesson plans. But the publisher was convinced there was a market for practical guides to property rights defense. The $45,000 advance seemed like lottery money, especially since I was essentially getting paid to organize information I'd already developed for my courses and speeches. What surprised me most was how much I genuinely loved this new career. Teaching teenagers about the Revolutionary War had been rewarding, but helping adults fight real-world tyranny felt like something I was actually meant to do. Every success story from my students, every corrupt official exposed, every fraudulent fine overturned, every community saved from financial theft, felt like another small victory against the Grace Perez's of the world. The financial transformation was staggering. By month 9, after Grace's conviction, I was earning more per month than I'd made in an entire year of teaching. Speaking fees alone brought in $15,000. The online courses generated another $12,000, and the lake access fees provided a steady 5-figure income that required almost no ongoing work. The scared, financially stressed teacher, who'd been swimming laps to forget his problems, had somehow become a successful entrepreneur with more money than he knew what to do with. But success brought new problems I hadn't anticipated. The private investigators following me became more obvious and more professional. As my business grew, I'd started noticing the same faces at multiple speaking engagements. People who claimed to be interested attendees, but asked very specific questions about my property, my security systems, and my daily routine. Luis confirmed my suspicions when he ran background checks on 3 of them. All were licensed PIs from Nevada, employed by firms that specialized in asset recovery and client protection service. Someone with serious money is very interested in your activities, Logan Luis warned me during one of our monthly check-ins. Asset recovery usually means someone thinks you have something that belongs to them, and client protection suggests they're willing to invest significant resources in getting it back. These aren't cheap rent-a-cops. These are professional intelligence gatherers, who cost $500 to $1,000 per day. The surveillance escalated as my public profile grew. Professional photographers with telephoto lenses were documenting my daily routines, my business meetings, even my garbage pickup days. They were building detailed profiles of my life, and the level of investments suggested whoever was paying them considered me either a serious threat or a valuable target. But a threat to what? And how valuable is it? Grace was in prison, her crimes exposed, her community influence destroyed. What could anyone possibly want from me at this point? The breaking point came when I returned from a 3-day speaking tour in Chicago to find clear evidence that someone had been living in my house while I was gone. Not searching. Someone had slept in my guest bedroom, used my shower, cooked meals in my kitchen, and spent considerable time going through every document in my home office. They had been careful to clean up after themselves, but not careful enough to avoid leaving traces of occupancy that made it obvious this wasn't a quick search. Luis's crime scene team found fingerprints that didn't match anyone in the criminal database, DNA evidence from someone who had been in my house for at least 48 hours, and signs of extremely sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment that had been installed and then removed. Whoever this is has training and resources that go way beyond typical private investigators, Luis told me grimly. This is getting into federal territory, Logan.
We might need to consider witness protection. Who hired private investigators to follow me? And why are they so interested in everything about my life? After Grace's conviction, my life had become something I never could have imagined. The scared teacher who'd been terrorized in his own backyard was now earning over $400,000 annually from speaking engagements, online courses, and lake access fees. I'd been featured on national news programs, consulted with state attorneys general on HOA reform legislation, and helped expose corrupt officials in 40. The Logan method of documenting and fighting institutional corruption had become a legitimate business with international reach. The speaking circuit had evolved from regional HOA conferences to major corporate events in university law schools. My standard keynote fee was now and I was booked solid through the following year with engagements in Canada, the UK, and Australia. Fortune 500 companies were hiring me to train their executives on leadership ethics and community relations, which felt surreal given that my expertise came from being victimized by a gambling-addicted dog killer. But success has a way of rewriting history, and suddenly everyone wanted to learn from the community justice expert. The education platform had grown beyond my wildest expectations. Over 15,000 students had completed various versions of my HOA defense courses, with a 94% success rate in resolving their corruption war. The certification program I developed was training paralegals and community advocates in property rights law, creating a whole network of people equipped to fight institutional abuse. Revenue from the education business alone was generating over $20,000 monthly, and the success stories kept pouring in from communities that had used my methods to expose theft, fraud, and abuse. My property investments were paying off spectacularly. Grace's foreclosed house, which I had purchased at auction for $156,000, had been transformed into a luxury vacation rental that earned over $10,000 monthly. Marketing it as the former HOA Karen's house had turned out to be brilliant. People were fascinated by the opportunity to stay in the scene of such dramatic comeuppance. The lake access fees had grown to $15,000 annually per community as demand far exceeded availability, creating a waiting list that let me be selective about which HOAs earned access privilege. But the private investigation, harassment had escalated to genuinely frightening levels. Professional surveillance teams were now documenting every aspect of my daily life with military precision. They knew my schedule better than I did, had photographed everyone I had spoken with, and seemed particularly interested in my business partnerships and financial arrangement. Louise had confirmed that the PI firms involved specialized in high-value asset recovery, which suggested someone believed I possessed something worth significant money. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening came from an unexpected Grace called me from prison, into her sentence. I almost didn't accept the call, but curiosity got the better of me. The woman on the phone was barely recognizable as the confident predator who'd terrorized my neighborhood. Prison had broken Grace completely. Her voice was weak, defeated, and genuinely remorseful in a way that sounded nothing like her courtroom performance. "Logan, I need to tell you something about why I really targeted your property," Grace said, without any preliminary conversation. "It wasn't random, and it wasn't just about money. There's something buried under your lake that people are willing to kill for, and they threatened my family to make me get you to sell it." The words hit me like ice water. "What are you talking about, Grace?" I asked, but she was already explaining the real reason behind her harassment campaign. Men in expensive suits approached me at the casino, where I was losing everything. They knew about my gambling debts, my foreclosure problems, everything. They offered to pay off all my debts and give me $50,000 cash if I could force you to sell your property. When I couldn't get you to sell voluntarily, they told me to escalate the pressure until you had no choice. Grace's voice was shaking as she continued. "They said if I failed, my adult children would have accidents. Logan, I poisoned Buddy because they threatened to kill my daughter." The revelation was staggering. Grace hadn't been operating alone. She'd been working for people who had been planning to acquire my property long before I'd even inherited it. "What's buried under my lake, Grace?" I asked, but her response was even more terrifying. "I don't know exactly, but they called it historically significant mineral deposits and said it was worth enough to justify any level of pressure to acquire the land. They have geological surveys, mineral rights documentation, everything needed to extract whatever's down there once they own the property." Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. "Logan, they're still planning to get your property. My failure just meant they needed a different approach. Those people following you aren't trying to hurt you. They're trying to find another way to pressure you into selling. But if that doesn't work, she didn't need to finish the sentence. People who'd threatened to kill Grace's children over mineral rights weren't going to give up just because their first plan had failed. The call explained everything that hadn't made sense about Grace's case. The expensive legal representation, the mysterious financial backing, the professional surveillance teams, all of it was connected to whatever was buried under my family's lake. Grace had been a desperate pawn in someone else's much larger game. And now that she'd failed and been exposed, they were moving to Plan B. But what was Plan B, and how much danger was I actually in?